Kia ora, everyone, and welcome to the Future Cities Research Hub Webinar Series 2021. This is the third webinar organized by the Future Cities Research Hub on the topic of climate change and how to address the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals 2030. I am Alessandro Premier. I'm a senior lecturer in architecture technology and sustainability at the University of Auckland School of Architecture and Planning. And I am also the coordinator and co-director of the Future City Research Hub with Timothy Welch, who is with us today, and Paola Boarin. The Future City Research Hub was established in 2017. It brings together researchers addressing different disciplines concerned with the built environment, and there are multiple interfaces with the natural environment. The Hub promotes research collaboration and cross-disciplinary approaches, leading to evidence-based understanding and design innovation for future cities. The aim of the Hub is to better understand the complexities of cities across the building, neighborhood, and urban scales, and to find innovative solutions to address built and natural environment challenges and contributing to the achievement of national, regional, and global sustainable development goals. Feel free to check out our website and our YouTube page. Especially in the YouTube page, you can find some interesting videos that are already there, uploaded. There are some recording for our first webinar on Solve Climate by 2030, and some videos from the 2020 Association of Pacific Rim University Sustainable Cities and Landscape Conference. You can follow us on Twitter as well, and you can also subscribe to our mailing list via our website to receive updates on our research and on educational activities. What are we discussing today? So in our first webinar, we addressed the big doable things that need doing in New Zealand if we really aim to stop climate change. In the second one, we focused on energy consumption and the emission of greenhouse gases coming from our buildings and cities, and the focus was on passive and active solution for buildings. A fourth webinar organized by the Future Cities was part of the Association of Pacific Rim University Sustainable Cities and Landscape Hub webinar series, and it was focused on smart cities. This webinar instead is focused on the effectiveness of smart transportation as a sustainable transportation system. In fact, the question that the two panelists are asking us is smart transportation the future of sustainable cities? There will be two fantastic presentations from our two amazing panelists today to address this question. So some household information as usual. The webinar will be recorded, and a link to the recording will be sent to all the people who are registered to this webinar. This will be sent out, of course, a few days after the webinar itself. Attending this webinar will give you 10 NZRAB CPD points for those who are practicing architects, of course. And feel free to post your question for our amazing panelists at any time during their presentation by using the Q&A box. Please do not use the chat, but use the Q&A box that is specifically dedicated for that. We will reserve some time at the end of the webinar to answer to your kind question. So now it's time to move to our presentation, the presentation of our panelists, and I really like to introduce the first panelist today, who is Mohsen, Dr. Mohsen Mohammadzadeh. And the title of his presentation is "Soon Will Be Too Late. Do these rapid mobility technologies generate dystopia?" So Dr. Mohsen Mohammadzadeh is a senior lecturer at the School of Architecture and Planning of the University of Auckland, where he is director of the urban planning program. Mohsen is a urban planner and designer with more than 12 years of professional experience. He worked in both public and private sectors in Iran and then in New Zealand. He has qualification in urban and regional planning and design and civil engineering. He specializes in critical urban theory, planning in late capitalism, planning and urban conflicts, globalization and the emerging global cities, smart city and ethics of big data, transportation and infrastructure planning as well. So Mohsen, thank you very much for being with us today. And I think I'll hand it over to you and to your amazing presentation.
Thank you very much, Alessandro. I really appreciate it actually for introducing me and also for this opportunity from the Future Cities Hub, Research Hub. I want to present my work today regarding to smart technology and especially disruptive mobilities, and which is I'm working for a couple of years. Let me share my screen with you. So I think you can see.
Yes.
So my argument here, if you can see my my presentation here. As I mentioned here, it's a lot of questions about disruptive mobility, and especially in regarding what will be the impacts of this kind of the technologies in the future. People mostly have a very positive perspective about new technologies, emerging technologies, which is very promising, But my argument, I want to present today is that, yes, it's very important to consider it, but if we are not planning for it, if we don't put the right plans and policies, the outcomes of the adaptations of this kind of technology will not necessarily lead us to the kind of utopia perspective generated in the society. But on the other hand, it may create a kind of dystopia for us. So let's check when I'm speaking about disruptive, what that really means. When we are speaking about the disruptive, somehow we are speaking about kind of the technology, can change the nature of the pre-existing type of industries existed. Can be this kind of the challenges for the pre-existing one can be based on providing a cheaper product, better quality, or even totally different alternative products, and facilities totally different. So it's quite normal. It's all the time we have this kind of in our history, especially during the last century and this century. We face this kind of disruptions and the technologies and new type of products and services coming and destroyed the pre-existing ones. I think if you are old enough, maybe you remember when we had video cassettes, and now then later on we had CDs, and nowadays we have Netflix. And we don't have, VHS, video, for example, anymore. Or if you're asking about the landlines, most of the time, in the past, it was a revolution. It was a kind of coming and become as a kind of disruptive for the telegraph. And then later on, we have a kind of the Skype, and nowadays we have a new emerging technology stuff. We have the same thing regarding to mobility. When we had the beginning of the 20th century, when we had car, as a kind of disruption in the society, and it's changed, rapidly the way we travel, and obviously the horses and camels and the other type of the transportation modes at that time were challenged and replaced by cars. This image from New York, shows that in the 13 years, as you can see here, we have just one car among the all other carriages here. But then after 13 years in the same place, there is no horses, there is no older time. So in a very short period of time, the technology changed and transformed, and people adopt themselves and use that kind of the technology quite rapidly. And this kind of the transformation also regarding adaptation of the technology is getting faster and faster and faster. For example, regarding to how people using the electricity, telephone, as you can see, for access to this kind of technology and using it, adoptions by the people getting faster. So it creates a kind of the kind of understanding. People, they eager more, to use the technology and adopt themselves, with a new technology faster. What that really means for us, as a planners, as a policymakers and architects, because when people are using technologies, you know, it impacts on the way, you know, they are acting and living, you know, and working in cities. So how it impacts. So if we look to the kind of the New Zealand, you know, for example, in New Zealand context, as you can see, the car ownership, you know, as a kind of a new mode, it was quite fast. And then, you know, kind of people using car and gain, you know, car ownership as one of the main modes, you know, and it was quite rapid, you know, and it's increasing all the time. It's not decreasing. But without the regulations, without any kind of the clear, you know, pathway or policies, you know, we had chaos. And the pictures about the past, you know, when we adopted technology and we didn't consider we need to regulate it, we need to put in the right place, shows us using this kind of technologies potentially can create more harms for us, sometimes increase the, you know, for example, accidents, death, you know, and some chaotic conditions. So as a people in the industry, in the planning, urban design, architecture, who aim to actually regulate the space and also create a harmony between the people and the functions and activities of the people in the built environment, it's become sometimes become quite challenging. If we remember that the rate of the adaptation and also the speed of the adaptation is quite fast. There is a problem. The problem is that even if we are aware about this, we are speaking about the bureaucratic system. The bureaucratic system, which means the plans and policies and regulations, they are not fast enough, you know, to develop, because bureaucratic system is quite slow. So how we can deal with it, especially when we see a new emerging technologies coming. But I want to look to the history, you know, how we manage it, how planners, architects, urban designers, you know, adopt this and change it, and thinking how we can actually look to the technology, not only as an, you know, disruptive ones, but using that in a kind of inspiring to address some of the issues we had. So if you look to the history of the industrialization, you know, we are speaking about the first, you know, in the steps of industrial revolution, we have steam engines and railways at the beginning. So obviously it's created kind of the pollutions. We know that in the history, you know, industrial cities become quite polluted and kind of problematic for people to live there. But at the same time, some people like, you know, Soria Mata in Spain, for example, suggested a kind of the linear city, you know, develop around the rail lines, you know, and develop kind of the multi-layer or multi-floors type of the development. And they implemented, you know, in Spain and some Russian cities, they implemented that kind of the idea. So however, that kind of technology perceived as a challenge at that time, but some intelligent, you know, planners and thinkers and architects look at it as a kind of the solution to escape, you know, from the kind of the problems they were facing at that time. When we look to the cars, you know, especially assembly line, you know, introduced by Henry Ford, especially Ford T, you know, as a kind of the revolutionized car industry as an assembly line, and provide a kind of the cheaper, more affordable type of cars for the middle class. That kind of, you know, opportunity create more, creating new opportunities for planners. Also, it's not just what we see as a kind of the accident, but also create a kind of the promise a new type of the lifestyle for people around the world. And the existing cities we are living largely shaped based on this assembly line and car ownership shaped at that period of time, but also gives us some hints actually to reduce some level of the problems we had in industrial cities before, and make it especially more accessible for people. So all the time, what I'm saying here, emerging technologies, disruptive technologies, they are inevitable. All the time we have progress in technology, but they can be disruptive. The disruptive can have a negative dimensions, you know, but at the same time can have a positive ones. It depends how you look at it. So land transport planning is one of the things, you know, one of the approaches we are thinking how we can use the, you know, kind of the technologies, especially the impacts of the transportation on the land use. As you see in the previous one, for example, the steam engines or kind of the trains, and at the beginning changed the land use in a particular way. Later on, we had car ownership, massive car ownership, and especially planners, urban designers, architects, thinks actually about how we can actually develop a system to accommodate and regulate that kind of the impacts, to have a better and most effective type of development, based on the limited resources we have, and mitigate the kind of the costs, or mitigate the undesirable outcomes of the using disruptive technologies like cars in the cities, and how we can improve the efficiencies here. So it's a lot of, as a planners and architects, urban designers, we know that, it's part of our job all the time to be sure all the land use activities have access, especially for cars, isn't it? So it's a part of the discussion. It's a kind of the things and the kind of the model we have in the planning. So how our plans and policies shape our behaviors and impacts or kind of the way we are using the technology. I use this graph shows that actually how people use the public transport against the vehicle ownership in the context of Auckland. So as you can see here around the 1950s is a shift, decreasing the number of the public transport trips in comparison to the vehicles, using the vehicles in the context of Auckland. And this image, interesting image from Mount Eden, shows that actually we had a tram, we had a kind of the access, but now it's become only car road. So why it happens? Some people working on that, and they realize that the decisions that were made at that particular time by planners and policymakers regarding to encouraging motorized type of transportation against the public transport impacts the way people using actually kind of the cars in later on. And some of the issues we have in Auckland, like traffic or kind of pollutions we have, and car dependency, I will refer to that later, we have in Auckland as a major issues, actually embeds in the kind of the plans and policies we implemented 50, 60 years back. So it's a kind of the discussions all the time we have in our classes, in the planning program. All of the plans and policies and all kind of the regulations and everything impacts on the current issue, but also it will continue and impacts on us for next coming decades or even maybe centuries. So we need to be careful what kind of plans and policies and what kind of regulations we do in the place, what kind of the technologies we are encouraging to be developed and implemented in cities, because it directly impacts on the people's behavior and the people travel behavior, and also the other dimensions like environmental, socio-economic, and even political dimensions of the industry. So when we're speaking about transportation, as I mentioned, that it's a kind of multi-layer phenomenon. It has a technological dimension, and I will refer to some of the technologies later on. It's emerging. It's part of the, part of the progress we have in our civilization all the time. We have emerging technology. They developed, introduced by industry, engineers working so hard actually to make it better, more efficient, type of technologies to us. So technology is coming to us, to us as a planners, as a designers and architects. So we'll have it. We cannot stop it. The question is that how we can accommodate it and direct it. It has some socio-cultural norms and values associated with this kind of technologies. I will refer to the couple of them. We are quite car-dependent society. I'm speaking about the New Zealand, especially in Auckland. Most of us, we own at least one or two cars. Some households, they have more than even two cars. And it's become kind of the values, because car ownership promoted, in the kind of the culture we are living, isn't it? Because when you look to the kind of the advertisements, regarding to brand new cars, all the time you see that actually brand new cars promoted, and advertised with promising happiness and enjoyment. Cars is not just a matter of the transportation. It's become part of our identity. The type of the cars we are using sometimes represent the social status we have, the income we have, or something like this. And prestige, just a sense of the prestige. Or even, when you see people, they are using big utes or a kind of the trucks, but they don't necessarily use it for their business activities. It's part of their identity. So we need to think that about this social cultural norms and values actually developed during the last century around the car. And most of the time we consider cars and car ownership as extended as a kind of extended home. It's a kind of a semi-private space, isn't it? Inside our car, it's our territory, So it's a kind of the things we need to consider. When you are speaking about the transport and transportation and mobility, we need to consider geospatial dimensions of that. Obviously, we have the distribution of the transportation, the technologies, and the access to the technologies will not be the same level everywhere around the cities and even in the national level. So it will be quite, diverse. So we need to consider because we are not just speaking about the wealthy middle class or wealthy people. We are speaking about the other people. We are speaking about the disadvantaged areas or neighborhoods in the cities. They are, most of the time they are especially in Auckland, they rely on the private car to access to their places. And also we have remote areas in the, remote regions around the country. So we need to think about that. So it's a lot of questions. Financial economic dimensions of that. Car industry is one thing. New emerging technology disruptions will change them. Major car producers, as you can see, they are coming and advertising, more and more electric cars, and they are going to the new format and the new models because they find it quite disruptive technology, kind of challenging for them. But what about us? How we can finance urban projects, because we know that the local governments, and the governments, they rely on the taxation and tax on the petrol. So what kind of alternative methods we need to use? It's a kind of the things, as a policymakers, planners, and designers, we need to think about this. Political dimensions, obviously, oil industry and car industry, and also construction companies, sometimes the major ones that are developing highways, and they have lobbies, in the politics. How we can deal with it? And also, what about the regulations, policies, and codes we have? So what else? We have a range. I can add more and more of this kind of layers to this. When we are speaking about the disruptive mobilities, they are quite promising. They have some impact and potentially can have some impact on us. One of them, they promise lower travel costs. It's great, because yes. All of us, we like actually to pay less for transportation, isn't it? But it can have some side effects, and I will explain that, especially in the next coming slides. It can have some adverse impacts on cities later on. People maybe travel longer, and because the nature of the perception of the traveling will be changed. We can do what we like. It will be totally different atmosphere. It will be totally different type of experience regarding to traveling. You can do what you like. You can do your work. You can watch TV, listen to music, be part of the discussion. So it's totally new type of experience for people. It potentially can add a new demands for traveling. Senior people. People that are not, for example, able to drive a car, they can easily book a car, autonomous cars, for example, and they can use autonomous cars there. And kids, they can be part of it. People, they can buy a particular autonomous cars for their kids, and instead of 2 cars for mother and father, we'll have 3, 4, 5 cars. Autonomous cars for each member of the family. We are speaking about the flying, cars. So it's a kind of the different type of things, isn't it? Land use will be changed significantly. We will not have a petrol stations anymore, but we need to have a space actually for a kind of autonomous cars or even flying cars. So then it dictates a new type of the land use, to us, generating a new type of the travel behavior. Maybe people travel in quite different ways, and then change their direction. If you are moving to the kind of more shared platforms, it can be a kind of alternative. Or as the team will kindly explain that, it's the future going to the bikes or more active modes, it will change the behaviors still later on. And we know that, especially, for example, when we are speaking about the e-bikes or e-scooters, more and more people, even the ones they were not using the bikes in the past, they are using e-bikes, especially in the context of Auckland, because e-bikes help actually the riders when going to the top hills or something like that. So it will be a solution. So maybe that kind of technology change the behaviors of people. And also, we need to have thinking and have a new urban planning and urban design and maybe architectural codes, because especially about a couple of the new type of emerging technologies like flying autonomous cars or taxis. Maybe the parking would be on the roof. So all kind of the design we have so far would be different. The worldview would be different. It will be bird worldview instead of the walking or car drivers view to the street. So we need to think about all kind of the changes we'll face in future. So when we are thinking about this kind of the technologies, it's disruptive mobilities. It's very challenging. I'm working in this area for a couple of years, 5-6 years. Obviously, we have electric vehicles that are quite well developed, now, and in the 5-6 years back, we had them, but we were not developed, and nowadays they are become quite faster, more efficient, and they are become quite longer, a distance they can travel, and also the charging time is quite faster now. So it's created a lot of, it's well developed technology. We have sharing platforms. We have e-scooters, e-bikes, motorbikes. They are evolving, but more or less I can say, they are well developed. The other ones, they are developing now. It's autonomous vehicles, delivery autonomous drones and airplanes. They are kind of technology. They are developed, but they are improved. So the other ones that are coming to us, they are flying autonomous vehicles, delivering autonomous vehicles, and something like this kind of technology. And the problem regarding this kind of technologies is that we don't know what will be the next, but we know that it's part of the all time I'm using the term unknown unknown. So I'm thinking all the time how we can actually accommodate that. It means that we need to be flexible and dynamic enough to accommodate that and put the regulations at the same time. We are, as I mentioned, that we are quite car dependent. So social cultural values quite dependent on this. And this graph shows that actually we are very car dependent. I'm not sure actually it's possible to shift that kind of a culture quite rapidly. We can discuss about that. We need to consider other dimensions like housing, land value. Imagine if you can go move, you can find a cheaper house out of the Auckland and you use your autonomous cars, pay less to come to the Auckland. So people may move out in that case. And it's a couple of the actual papers I prepared, and they are open access. So I will pass it to you guys later on. If you have questions, you can come back to me. And so it can be promising, the new technology, but at the same time create more problems in the future for us. Sorry, it seems that I'm going beyond the time limit. Sorry, Alessandro. Thank you. I'm open for the questions. Thank you very much for your attention, though.
Thank you very much, Mohsen. It's a very inspiring presentation, and there are questions I see in the chat already. So it's very good, and we will be happy to discuss.
Sure, happy to respond.
Yeah. After team presentation. So now it's time to move to our second presentation, and it will be given by Dr. Tim Welch. So the title of the presentation is Your Next Car Should Be a Bike. Very provocative title, I would say. And Dr. Tim Welch is a senior lecturer at the School of Architecture and Planning of the University of Auckland, where he is co-director of the Future Cities Research Hub. Team specializes in transportation, infrastructure, and urban modeling, with a focus on the use of big data and technology. Much of team research is applied with a focus on equity and climate change. His past work has included analysis of public transportation performance and connectivity, evaluating the efficacy of policy aimed at mitigating climate change, developing models to measure housing value and other physical impacts on transportation infrastructure investments, and investigating the travel behavior influences on the built environment, of course. So thanks, Tim, for joining us, and I'll hand it over to you.
Great, thanks, Alessandro. Okay, I'll just jump right into it here. Let me pull up my presentation. Okay, yeah, so as Alessandro mentioned, title presentation, next car should be a bike, or more apt, dispelling 10 myths about reducing autocentricity and increasing cycling. The proposition I'm arguing for is that as we plan for our future cities or sustainable cities, what we need to plan for is active modes of public transportation over the car. And obviously in all places, and especially in Auckland and New Zealand, can be a contentious argument. So I'll just jump right into all of the 10 myths and present some of the research behind this. It's not necessarily just my research, a pull from a variety of sources. And the first argument we hear when we talk about what we can do to reduce the need for automobiles or accommodate automobiles in a more sustainable future city is slowing down the car. There's been initiatives here in Auckland and all around New Zealand and across the world under the Vision Zero policy program, which is to reduce traffic related fatalities, especially for people outside of the car, to zero by some date, usually 2030. And that usually one of those big policies, despite some arguments for and against Vision Zero in general, one of the important policies behind that is reducing vehicle speeds, especially in urban areas. And the argument that's always made is that slower speeds will ruin my commute. It'll take forever. The evidence doesn't really support that, though. For a variety of reasons. So one of the myths behind this is that it'll kill my commute. It'll take an extremely long time to go from, let's say, 50 kilometers per hour to 30. And so here's just a quick graphic. This is actually from Auckland Transport. But this kind of study and evidence has been replicated all over the world. So even pretty substantial reductions in speed tend to have fairly minimal, and they're measurable but minimal impacts on travel speed or commutes specifically. So let's say in this case, movement from 50 kilometers per hour to 30 kilometers per hour, which is a common one, especially in urban areas, adds about 48 seconds per kilometer traveled. If we look at somewhere like Auckland, we're talking about a 11.9 kilometer commute for a work trip. So that's an average of about 23 minutes now with minimal traffic. And so that would add about another 9 minutes. So not an insignificant amount, but where the benefits really come from are not for the people necessarily inside the vehicle, but everybody outside that vehicle. So reduction from 50 kilometers per hour reduces the likelihood of a fatality from a collision between a car and a person from 80% to 10%. So that makes those interactions, if they do occur, survivable. Of course, a traffic flow that's more predictable, a traffic flow that doesn't stop and go and force drivers to kind of swerve around other cars is safer for those outside the car as well. So beyond just a reduction in the likelihood of a fatality from a vehicle collision, it also reduces the probability of a collision. So it makes it safer for everybody. And then to tack onto that, how it won't ruin an individual commute, we talk about in planning, in transportation planning, especially the planning time index. And that's the amount of time typically you have to pad to your trip to kind of get to your destination at a specific time, knowing that you're likely to encounter some congestion, or one day it'll be smooth sailing, and then the next day you'll be stuck in traffic. And so you have to leave, let's say 15 minutes early from your house every day, just to be sure you can arrive there on time. With traffic that's slowed down, we reduce that congestion, reduce the likelihood of queues, and reduce the need for large padding on either end of your trip. And as a result, drivers will save time as well. So that kind of myth is kind of the first one that comes up and hopefully easily dispensed with. The other one, and this one's more hot a topic than I expected it to be today. If you're in New Zealand and you read the front page of the New Zealand Herald, you saw that Auckland Council is moving forward with a plan to give power to AT to remove street or on-street parking, essentially. And of course, the first argument that comes up along those lines is if you do that, you're going to kill business all along those local roads. And that's just not a fact that's borne out. It's something that people get worried about and talk about a lot, but it's not borne out in the evidence. And one fairly recent study, just to pull up because it has good graphics, but this, again, these results have been replicated all across the world. When we talk about local travel, this is from Toronto, but when we talk about local shops, who goes to those places are people that are local. They live there, they work there, or they live and work there together. And what most research has found is that about 96% of the traffic that goes into local shops is done either by foot or by bike or by public transportation. 72% of that is active transportation. So very little of the traffic or the business that's utilizing local shops actually arrives by car. And this misperception comes from individual shop owners themselves, where we find evidence that over 25% of merchants typically think over 25% of their customers arrive by car, and around 50% or more of merchants think that more than half of their, 25% of merchants think that more than half of their customers arrive by car. And again, that's typically just 4% of people get there by car. So that parking is not as critical. In fact, you can flip it on its side and say traffic and driving and parking at local shops is actually what's killing local business. And then further evidence to bolster that has shown, and again, replicated in many cities, that traffic, those that arrive by active transportation or public transportation tend to spend more money and frequent those shops more often than those that arrive by car. So active transportation and public transportation are really significant factors in bolstering local businesses and don't have the impact. It is not a significant impact when parking is removed from those locations. Another one is that electric cars and AVs will be a game changer for congestion. We often look for transportation to save us or to get us out of the cities that we've built or the climate disaster that we see coming. And the fact is that transportation technology in the form of a car really isn't going to save us from that. One of this, and this is just kind of a meme, it's not evidence per se, but when you talk about electric cars specifically, and to some degree, at least for the foreseeable future, AVs, when we talk about changing cities with more cars, we still face the same problems we talk about now. Significant amounts of congestion throughout the city and on our highways. And so it doesn't change the form of the city. What we should be looking at is ways in which we can reduce the demand for and the need for automobiles so that our cities can scale back down to a human size, where we can start to reach things within a walking or public transportation trip or a bike trip, rather than needing to get into a car. And a little bit more on electric cars, even if we look at the electric car, which has been available widely in the form of Nissan Leaf and then Tesla and others, which have followed suit for the last decade, even in that last decade, the market penetration for fully electric cars is very small. Now, this graphic's from 2019, so it's a couple years old, and it's before the Freebate program, which may have increased the overall fleet mix somewhat, but we're still talking about less than 1% of the total fleet is fully electric. And so if we want to talk about how electric cars will be game changers, will add to our climate, our emission mitigation goals, the fact is that within the next 50 years, we'll still have a fleet that's probably less than 50% electric. And so we can't just rely on cars being buying new cars to buy ourselves out of our environmental woes, I guess you could say. So some recent evidence, and this is from this year, is that globally 1 in 50 cars were fully electric by 2020, right? So that's a pretty small number overall. It's about 2% globally of cars are fully electric. So even if every new car that was sold from today on was electric for the next 20 years, it would still just barely replace fossil fuel fleet, which would miss most of our climate and emission mitigation goals that we signed on to. So what many have started to argue is that cycling or electric bikes really will be up to 10 times more important than electric cars in reaching the net zero emission goals for cities. And that's for a number of reasons, but simply because you can replace so many car trips with an electric bike, and the amount of emissions that's required to develop an electric bike is so much smaller than the impact of an electric car. If we look at life cycle emissions and things like that, they have a much larger potential and much quicker uptake if we plan the infrastructure for them appropriately. Another one is that AVs will revolutionize our transportation system and our cities. If we want AVs to have the impact we hope they are going to make, especially on the demand for new roads, on the efficiency of traffic movement, and ultimately climate or emission mitigation, we're looking at evidence that showed that we'll need about 9 out of 10 cars, or 90% fleet mix of AVs, in order to have significant reductions or reduce the need for further expansion of roads to accommodate the growth in demand for vehicle travel. To get there is going to take a significant amount of time to achieve those efficiencies, that 9 out of 10 cars. By 2030, the most recent market evidence suggests that 1 out of 10 cars may be AVs globally. So there's a long ways to go between now and then, especially when our climate goals again start to target around 2030 as major goalposts. In this case, we'll have about 10% of a fleet that could potentially be AVs. And that's not 100% autonomous. That's, where we're talking level 5 autonomy. That's some mix in between where we see some autonomous features. So we cannot rely on AVs and self-driving technology alone to change the way our cities will work or to make a sustainable city. We'll have to look for other modes. And of course, one of the older ones, and I'm sure most people know this already, is that adding road capacity reduces congestion. That's another big myth that we've talked about for years and years. And that can be dispensed with pretty easily with the idea of induced demand. And that's when we widen a road or add a lane, the idea that solves our traffic congestion problems. If that was the case, most of our highways would be free flowing, but we know that to not be the case at all. And this largely stems from the idea, again, of induced demand, or as Tony Downs in the 60s termed, was triple convergence. And this idea, when we add more capacity to our roads, individuals will change their behavior. So where somebody may have taken another mode, been fed up with traffic, so they decided to take the bus, a train, or perhaps they decide to walk or bike, they'll switch back from that mode onto cars as they see, back to their car as they see travel times being reduced along their old route. Or perhaps they've switched to another route to avoid that congestion, and they'll go back to their old route now that it's more free flowing, at least temporarily. Or if they've changed their travel, their time of day that they travel, maybe they go into work earlier or later, they'll go back to that original time. And so most of that capacity we add is usually consumed within 3 or 4 years at about an 80% level. So no matter how much we add, we continue to induce people to travel more by car and by that mode or by that route. So it typically doesn't have the congestion relieving impacts that we assume they'll have when we do our forecasting models. And then so the last part here will be kind of on some of the dispelling the quick myths on biking itself. So what do we worry about when we suggest people should take a bike? Obviously, whether it's too cold, too hot, too wet, or some combination of all of those. And the fact is, people have biked in all weather conditions all across the globe, and they've done it happily. It's a matter of gear, but it's more importantly a matter of infrastructure. If we provide the infrastructure that's safe for a variety of riders, the riders themselves will figure out their level of comfort and how to navigate a city in all sorts of weather conditions. It can be done. People are interested in doing it, but they're not interested in riding, let's say, in a rainstorm, in mixed traffic with heavy vehicles passing at a close distance. We provide protected lanes where they can safely navigate the city on a bike. People will do it in most conditions. Of course, the argument that bikes can't do much else than provide you with some exercise is also a common myth. So people are using bikes for all sorts of things. The electric bike has really kind of revolutionized biking as a mode, and adding cargo bikes to that mix can be significant. So people all across the globe use bikes to do things like grocery shopping, take their kids to school, transport goods for delivery. It can all be done with a bike just as efficiently, or oftentimes faster than in a car. We just again have to have that infrastructure and the availability of the supply of the bikes themselves for people to be able to switch to a biking mode or an active mode over the car. And of course, in Auckland and Wellington and other places, you hear the argument that we just have too many hills for it to be feasible for people to bike on a regular basis. And that's a fair argument in many places. But when we talk about planning for bikes, we look at a maximum 8% grade, or for a short distance. Anything higher than that, and it'll be difficult for a person on a traditional push bike to go over that grade and continue pedaling efficiently. So this is a map. It's a little hard to read because it's zoomed out, but of gradients that are greater than 8% in Auckland. And this is a gradient that are lower than 8% in all of Auckland. The vast majority of roads in Auckland are well below that threshold of 8%, so considered bikeable by a traditional bike. In fact, and this from, this is pretty well used graphic before, but 73% of streets in Auckland have a slope less than 3%, and 3% is a very easy grade for almost every rider. And we add on to that the idea of electric bikes again, and that flattens out most hills. They can be a bit more of an investment than a traditional push bike, but they open up the streets for a much larger swath of the population and make a larger set of objectives or purposes on your bike accessible to people. So hills are viewed by the rider often as a bigger challenge than they really present. If we have more cycling, it means more crashes, more injuries, and more death. That's not a good reason to avoid planning for cycling. Evidence from around the world again shows that the more that people cycle, the fewer the fatalities per billions of kilometers cycled are. So there's safety in numbers. And that's for a couple of reasons. First of all, the more people that are out cycling, the more aware drivers are, and the better they get at navigating safely around cyclists, so that it's less danger presented to the cyclists themselves. But also the more demand for cycling, the better the infrastructure is. So those two things combined typically reduce the danger to cyclists and the number of injuries and deaths. So getting more people out cycling actually will produce a better result than trying to get people away from cars only. And then lastly, low income people need or want cars to get around. This is a common myth that comes up typically because we've underdeveloped our infrastructure for low income people. They typically live farther away from job centers, entertainment centers, things like that. And it makes it more difficult to cycle or walk for activities or for work. But what we see is, and this is a little bit older, but the evidence has been reproduced in many studies across the world, is that lower income people typically are greater users, especially for commute trips, of active transportation modes. And so not only do lower income people want to cycle, but they need that infrastructure investment so that they can replace that costly car trip with an active mode. And so that's kind of the end of my 10 myths, and I'll hand it back over to Alessandro for any questions and answers.
Oh, fantastic, Tim. Thank you very much for your presentation. I have to say that the two presentations were complementary, really complementary. So I had some questions from the first one, but you responded to some of the questions in the second one in your presentation, Tim. So that means that the two presentations were really complementary. So thank you very much again, and inspiring, of course. Yeah, we have a question from Sandy, and it's for Mohsen. So Mohsen, Sandy is interested to hear what you think about the future of Elon Musk's boring company Hyperloop.
Thanks, thanks, Sandy, for the question. Actually, it's quite interesting and it's great to see actually some people, futuristic people, thinking about the alternatives. And from my perspective, it's that kind of the Hyperloop will create opportunities, especially for traveling between the long distances, not necessarily inside the city. But it's a lot of question about the cost and the impacts of this kind of projects, and even regarding to the long distance, traveling between the continents or the major large countries like US or Canada. Maybe it's feasible, but we need to, at the same time, we need to consider other alternative emerging technologies, competing, because at the end, it's a kind of a market, isn't it? And feasibility and the impact will be considered. For example, as I know, the other alternative would be, more environmental friendly type of, airplanes, or, kind of the, even reducing the travel, at all. It will be kind of the alternative by generating another type of the technologies. It's not necessary to move around at all based on the kind of the program and other type of the technologies though. So I think it's good to have this kind of the futuristic perspectives, but we need to see, what kind of the impacts, will have in the garden, and what are they feasible, and what kind of the problems they can address in long term for us.
Yes, sure. Thank you very much, Mohsen.
And Alessandro, I can add, kind of just add to that a little bit too. I think Mohsen makes a great point. There's a lot of different emerging technologies. The problem is getting fascinated by technologies while ignoring the things that already exist and aren't being done currently. So if you look at a good example of what the Boring Company can do or has done, is an example of what they've done in Las Vegas in the US, where they promised a tunnel that would efficiently move people across the city quickly in a new kind of tram system. And what it turned out to be is essentially, not to be insulting, but a sewer tunnel for Teslas. And that's about all it does. It drives a car through a tunnel quickly, somewhat quickly. There's no spectacular technology behind it. And so billions of dollars were diverted from things like public transportation that could have a lot higher carrying capacity. And that sort of thing is also happening with Hyperloop, where we're diverting huge amounts of funds over to an unproven technology where we have high-speed rail and other technologies that could be more used. So moving public dollars into private space for technology that's unproven. It's good for research. It's not so great for cities.
I totally agree. Thanks, Tim.
Thanks, Tim. So there is another question from Alan. As a question for Tim this time, should we lobby government for a cargo e-bike subsidy scheme?
Yeah, we should. If it's fair to encourage the use of electric automobiles, it's absolutely fair that we should argue for the use of a subsidy for e-bikes. They're cheaper and they're easier to maintain. They're easier to spread to a larger amount of the population. For a single e-bike, for a single subsidy for an electric car, you could buy 2 or 3 e-bikes that are of good quality. And if they were to be manufactured, let's say here in New Zealand, that number could be up to 10 or more. for a single electric car. And of course, they don't take up the road space necessarily that an electric car does, the storage space, the parking space. So absolutely, I think they'd be more equitable, and they should be a consideration. There was some talk about the government subsidizing government employees for e-bike purchases. And that's a step in a good direction, but that should also happen for the general population as well.
Oh, thank you very much, Tim. There are quite a lot of questions for you now. So there is a question from Andy. He says, who needs to be involved in order to bring about this transformation? Is it led by local government working with central government and local businesses?
Yeah, I mean, when we talk about planning now in New Zealand, the new place we're going is the idea of spatial planning. So that's a centralized organization of what areas should look like, implemented at the local level. So it really has to be taking place at every level. So there should be guidance from the national government on what they see cities achieving, and some of that's existing today with our urban development policies. But where the kind of rubber hits the road, no pun intended, is where at the local level. So council should take the lead on planning for the infrastructure necessary to comfortably bike. And most people will bike if they have a protected bike lane, if they have a network that connects them from their home to shopping to their work. And the best place for that to occur is at the local level, but it has to be resourced at the national level. They can't just do it by themselves.
Okay, thank you very much, Tim. We have another question for you, but I think we are running out of time. So I really say, and we will be able to respond to this question via email. So we will respond to you. Thank you, Irash. We will respond to you via email directly. Thank you very much for your question. Thanks again to both panelists for this great presentation today. Thank you very much, Moza, and thank you very much, Tim. I'd like to say thank you very much also to the School of Architecture and Planning, that is hosting basically Future Cities, our faculty, Creative Arts and Industry, and the University of Auckland, of course. What's next for us? So we are this is the last webinar for this year, for the Future Cities Research Hub series. And we will prepare a new series for 2022. So stay tuned to receive news and updates on other events organized by Future Cities. So please feel free to subscribe to our YouTube channel or our website to receive our news. Thank you very much again to all the people who attended this webinar. Thank you very much, and see you soon. Bye.
Thank you, Alison.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Yeah.